Hello everyone, and thanks to Morag for the introduction. So I'm Lisa Calderwood, I'm the Principal Investigator of Next Steps, and the aim of my presentation is to give everyone a brief introduction to Next Steps at study level, and I'll give a bit of history and background to the study, why it's important, and also highlight some policy impacts and research findings. The next session will go into much more detail about the age 25 survey, so this will be a very general introduction at the study level. So, Next Steps is an important national study following the lives of around 16,000 people in England who were born between 1989 and 1990. It began in 2004 when the study members were aged 13 to 14 years old, and they were sampled through schools. Almost 650 state and independent secondary schools, as well as pupil referral units, were included to ensure that the sample was representative of all young people in that age group. Following the initial survey at 13 to 14, study members were visited every year until 2010, when they were 19 to 20, so for 7 sweeps. It was the Department for Education who set up the study in 2004, and they funded and managed the first 7 sweeps. It was originally designed by them to study educational transitions, and they were particularly interested in following the sample between the ages 14 to 19, as this is when young people make key transitions from compulsory schooling to further education, university training, and ultimately entry into the labour market. However, when the study members reached age 19 to 20, they were no longer in the policy remit of the Department for Education, so the study was stopped in 2010. We're very pleased to say that we've been able to restart the study. And in 2013, the management of the study transferred to the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, and the Economic and Social Research Council have funded a further sweep of data collection at age 25, which took place in 2015-2016. We're hoping to continue to follow up the study members into adulthood, ideally with interviews every 3 to 5 years, like the other cohort studies at CLS. Also, just to mention, lots of you will probably know the study as the longitudinal study of young people in England, and we're now referring to it as Next Steps. So, why is Next Steps important? Well, the UK has got a long history of running studies like Next Steps, which are referred to as cohort studies. The earliest study began in 1946 to study the post-war generation. Since then, studies have been following successive generations from birth at regular intervals, and CLS runs 3 of these studies, which are also funded by the ESRC. So this slide shows the 3 other cohort studies run by CLS, which are still following generations born in 1958, 1970, and 2000. All of those 3 studies started at birth and are still continuing today. So as you can see, there was this 30-year gap in this tradition of setting up new birth cohort studies between 1970 and 2000. But by continuing to follow the lives of those born in 1989 to 90 into adulthood, Next Steps will help to fill this gap and greatly improve our understanding of how British society and lives are changing from generation to generation. However, just to emphasise, unlike the other birth cohorts, Next Steps participants were not followed from birth. Rather, they were recruited at age 13 to 14 in 2004. So just to say a bit more about why Next Steps is important. So as I've mentioned, it is the missing cohort filling the gap between the 1970 and the Millennium Cohort Study. And by restarting and continuing Next Steps, it's really of key scientific and strategic importance for UK social science, which was why the ESRC has chosen to fund a further wave of data collection. The Next Steps generation are experiencing challenges and circumstances which are unique to their generation. Often referred to as the millennial generation, they grew up during the first major advances of the internet, social media, and new technology. The opportunities of globalisation, cultural diversity, and equal rights have grown rapidly during their lifetimes. But it's not been a generation without challenges. They entered the workforce during the worst economic recession since the Depression, and the global war on terror broke out during their lifetime. Social inequalities have also persisted across countries around the world. But Next Steps is the only major national longitudinal study focusing on pathways through the teenage years and transitions into adulthood for this crucial generation. Following them up will mean that researchers are able to study how people's experiences as teenagers affect how we turn out later on and gain a better understanding of the lives of this age group. It will also enable governments to evaluate the success of policies aimed at this group of adults, and we hope to be able to continue to follow them up throughout their adult lives, building an even more complete picture of what life is like for this generation. The study has already been very influential and used extensively by researchers, analysts, and policymakers across government. So this next slide shows just a few examples of how Next Steps has already had a direct impact on government policy. So I'll just go through some of these examples briefly. So firstly, raising the participation age in formal education and training so that young people must now stay on in some form of educational training until their 18th birthday. Evidence from Next Steps fed directly into this decision, and it was the findings from Next Steps which has shown that it was mainly vulnerable and low achieving young people who drop out of school at 16, and they're the group that are most in need of the additional skills required through continuing their education and training. Secondly, improving the quality and choice of vocational qualifications. So Next Steps findings have demonstrated to the government the need for them to improve the quality of these practical qualifications or apprenticeships available to young people, as for many years these qualifications have not been successful in helping young people to secure their jobs that they want in the labour market. Findings from Next Steps were also used in setting up the Educational Maintenance Allowance, which was a scheme to help young people from low-income families with the cost of travel, books and equipment to go to school and college. We can also see the impact that Next Steps has had on the next generation, and specifically due to several anti-bullying campaigns and initiatives, as well as guidance to schools about how to stop bullying, there's now much more awareness and strategy around preventing bullying. And as a result, recent research has shown that pupils today are less likely to be bullied at school than the Next Steps generation were. Just staying on the theme of bullying, this next slide just highlights some recent findings that we've looking at in more detail at bullying of sexual minority groups. So that's young people who self-identify as lesbian, gay or bisexual. We found that they are at more risk of bullying than their heterosexual peers, both when they were at school, and also in early adulthood. So what does the Next Steps data include? So I'll just finish up by giving a bit of detail about what the data includes, particularly for the first 7 sweeps, as we'll cover the content of the age 25 data in detail in the next presentation. So this slide gives an overview of the study to date and a bit more detail on each of the sweeps of data collection. So the study member has completed questionnaires themselves at every sweep. In sweeps 1 to 4, the survey was conducted via face-to-face interviewing in people's homes, and that included interviews with study members' parents. From sweep 5 onwards, it was only the study member who was interviewed. And from sweep 5 onwards, the study also adopted a mixed mode approach in which the young person could complete the interview either online, over the telephone or face-to-face. And that approach was retained at sweep 8. The survey data has also been supplemented by linked administrative data from the National Pupil Database at Key Stage 2, 3 and 4. And we've also collected an extensive range of data linkage consents at age 25. In relation to sample sizes and response rates, the achieved sample sizes for each sweep are shown on the slide. So the original sample was 15,770 at the first sweep, and this was boosted with a further 352 Black Caribbean and Black African pupils at sweep 4 in 2007, increasing the size of the cohort to 16,122. For sweeps 1 to 7, only study members who'd participated at the previous sweep were reapproached. So the response rates shown on the slide for sweeps 1 to 7 are sweep-on-sweep response rates amongst the issued sample. For age 25, we decided to go back to as many as possible of the 16,000 cases who'd ever taken part. As you can imagine, this was a considerable challenge, bearing in mind their age and the fact that they had not been contacted for 5 to 10 years. And we managed to interview 7,707 young people, which was around half of those approached. So this next slide just gives an overview of the different topics that have been included in the surveys during the school years and in early adulthood. So I won't go through in detail what's on the slide, but just to say education was the primary focus of the study, but the study has always included some broader content. Obviously, the content of the questionnaires have changed over time and as the study members have grown older to keep up with transitions in their lives. And the next presentation will include a lot more detail of the topics that we included at age 25. So that's the end of my introductory presentation. Thank you for listening. I'm very happy to answer any questions. So somebody has asked a question about the links to the NPD data. So that data is available via secure access at the moment in the UK Data Service, and that's for Key Stage 2, 3 and 4. And we will say a bit more in the next presentation about the data linkage consents that we've collected at age 25. We've also had some questions about whether the data that was collected, presumably at age 25, matches to the data collected in BCS and NCDS. Again, we will say a little bit more at the next presentation about what's in the age 25 questionnaire, but the study has at age 25 is much more comparable to the other cohort studies, BCS and NCDS and also MCS, than perhaps it has been than it had been for the first 7 sweeps. Somebody's asked about the comparisons with the second cohort. So presumably that's the second cohort of the longitudinal study of young people in England. So that's the second cohort that the Department for Education have started, where they're kind of replicating the same design and following another cohort of young people between age 14 and 19. I think that certainly the comparisons between the Next Steps cohort and the second cohort of LSYPE are definitely something which will be of research interest to some researchers, and I think that's something that can be, the data from that study is the data is run by the Department of Education, but the data will be available in the archive for comparisons. So we've had a question about the employment module, but we'll come back to that in the next presentation, I think, because we'll talk in a lot more detail about what's in the questionnaire at age 25.
So we've had a question saying that they'd like to talk offline about some of the linkage data. So please stay on the presentation and hopefully we'll be able to answer it during the presentation today. If not, please get in touch using the CLS help desk and we'll try and answer specific questions if we're not able to address them now.
So yeah, we've had a question about the mixed mode. So that was something that happened back at sweep 5. There's been relatively little done on mixed mode to date in the study, and that's not something that we've been able to explore so far. But it's certainly something that we're very aware of, the importance of mode comparisons, and we're aware that there's a lot of interest in that. So that's something that we will be considering looking into and providing more guidance to users in the future, but to date we've not been able to look at that.